I'm going to Arizona next week, and we look forward to that. And I'm going to, I hope, Ohio very soon. And we're going to start to move around, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll have some massive rallies and people will be sitting next to each other.
I'm Julie Pace.
I'm Ralph Russo. From the Associated Press, this is Ground Game Inside the Outbreak.
Every day, Ralph will be bringing you coronavirus coverage straight from the breakout zones.
The coronavirus pandemic ranks among the most dynamic and widespread stories ever covered here at the AP, and we've got you covered from every part of the globe.
Today, we're in Washington, D.C., talking about the ways that President Trump and the White House are addressing the pandemic and the economic fallout.
Well, Julie, thanks again for joining me to talk about sort of the crossroads between politics and the pandemic. There are a lot of places where they do connect. And again, thanks for joining us and providing a little insight.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So the president and vice president are starting to get on the road again. The president has a trip scheduled to Arizona next week. The vice president has already been out and about, including a trip to the Mayo Clinic that drew some criticism because he did not wear a mask in the hospital. What's the message they're trying to send by getting back out on the road?
The president and the vice president want to send a message that it's time for Americans to start getting back to work, that it's time for us to take baby steps, not full, steps, but baby steps toward reopening the economy, toward getting the American economy, revved up again. And one of the ways that they can do that is to hit the road themselves. And they both Pence and Trump have been pretty much grounded, since the pandemic began. Pence has been out a little bit more. He's taken a couple of trips, to various places around the country, but the president has been completely grounded and he has really been agitating to get back out there. What he would prefer to do is hit the road and do big campaign rallies. That's obviously not going to happen at this point. But one way that he can stretch his legs, quite literally to some extent, is to go and do some fly-arounds around the country to highlight different companies that are involved in the response. So his first trip will be to Arizona. He's going to be going to a Honeywell facility that's been expanding its production to include production of N95 respirator masks. And so this is the president, cheering on this company, this private business, but also again showing that he's not going to be confined to the White House and that he's signaling to Americans that they too can start to take some baby steps to get back out there.
Before we move on from that, I just want to clarify. So are there any plans in the works, anything behind the scenes for his next rally? Again, even when he's not in campaign mode, he loves those rallies. Has there been any talk about possibly trying to set up one of those?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it. And certainly we know that the president wants to get back out there and wants to hold the rallies. I think the reality is that, his team, is struggling to come up with a way to be able to do that safely, even in these states that are starting to open up where you do see restrictions lifted on businesses. There are still restrictions on really large gatherings. And these rallies, can draw tens of thousands of people depending on the size of the venue where he's being held, and that's just not going to be feasible right now and might not be feasible for much of this presidential campaign. I mean, I think that's one of the things that both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign are grappling with right now is it's not just a potential short-term change in their plans. This could be a long-term change for how they campaign throughout the next 6 months.
So while the president has been somewhat tethered to the White House, he has been meeting recently over the last couple of weeks with governors, some who he has butted head with, such as New York's Andrew Cuomo, and some he sees as allies, such as Florida's Ron DeSantis. I think most recently he met with New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. Is there a common goal with these meetings and any sense that they have been productive?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things at play here. One, the White House is trying to put Trump in settings where he looks a little more presidential, where he's not just sparring with reporters in these daily briefings that had come to dominate, much of what the public was seeing of him. So they're trying to put him more in the Oval Office. He's also meeting with business leaders, but certainly the meetings with governors, I think, have been a particular focus, in part because the White House is trying to show that they have good relations with the states. So much of the US response has been, at this nexus of the federal government and the state government because of the way that our system of government is set up. The feds can't do everything, and the states, while they have a lot of autonomy, still do rely on the federal government. And so Trump has really been trying to get ahead of some of this criticism that we've seen from the states about the federal response. And, he thinks that if he can meet with some of these governors in person, one, they can come to understand his position a little bit better, but two, also it puts him in the room with people who frankly are rated higher than he is by the public in terms of their response. If you look at our AP surveys, if you look at other polling that is out there, consistently the public is giving the governors a better rating, a better job approval on their handling of the pandemic than the president and the federal government. So this is a way for Trump to actually kind of side up to people who are a little more popular in this moment than he is.
You mentioned that intersection where what is the responsibility of the federal government, what are the responsibility of states. Maryland recently got FDA approval for the use of thousands of coronavirus tests it purchased from Korea. That's great news for the state of Maryland, but it sort of underscores what we're talking about. What's the responsibility of the Fed? What's the responsibility of the states? What is the responsibility, or where do we stand federally, nationally on testing? What's been the message from the White House on that? Because it seems to have been a thorn in the side of the president, quite frankly, throughout this crisis.
The message from the White House on testing to the states is pretty much that you're on your own. They really have told the states that they are responsible for producing, for running tests, for ensuring that their populations are getting tested. The people who need it most, and that has really rankled a lot of these states who say, wait a minute, like where is the federal government in all of this? Where are you, to help us with this process? And certainly I think the federal government is not as though they are doing nothing, but they have said pretty clearly, we are an option of last resort. If you can't get this done on your own, then you can come to us. And it creates this system where the states are kind of competing against each other. We've seen some states move to almost work in tandem, have these consortium of multiple states, so that they're not always competing against each other. Maybe they can do purchasing together, distribution together, have labs, in one large state, maybe handle testing from another smaller state. So there is an effort by the states to link up here, but they are on their own largely for testing, and that has been a great frustration for them.
So the number of unemployed Americans continues to climb. We're at about 30 million right now. Bring us up to date, if you could, Julie, on where Congress is on relief packages for struggling Americans and corporations. What snags are being worked out from previous packages, and where might lawmakers look to provide a boost next?
Yeah, a lot of the attention on Capitol Hill right now is on what comes next in terms of rescue money, and there are a couple of things that lawmakers are looking at. One, there's been a lot of discussion about trying to get an infusion of cash into state and local governments. There's a real worry that you're going to see state and local governments have to start laying off workers, that they're not going to have enough money to provide essential services, and so Democrats have really been pushing on this. And interestingly, Mitch McConnell had been pretty opposed to this, and then he got quite the backlash after he made some statements about that. And now he's on board too, saying yes, we will have to give some money to state and local governments. So I would expect to see a lot of discussion about what that number looks like. The other really interesting thing that has come up is there is a lot of talk about how to make businesses have very little or no liability if they open up and their workers get sick. Basically, Republicans right now are saying that it would be unfair for those businesses to be held liable if they opened up and a bunch of workers came back and then found themselves with coronavirus. And this is a really complicated debate. Workers wondering, do they have any protections in this situation, and businesses saying, how could you prove that we were liable? You can get this virus, as we know, so many different ways. How could you prove that it was because you were coming to work right now? So I think you're going to see a debate really coming to a head over workers' rights, corporate responsibility, and that could, because there is such a gap between the parties, I think really slow down some of this. And then the other thing, certainly that there's a lot of talk about is small business funding. How much more money is going to be needed there? We saw the initial two tranches of money that have gone to small businesses ran out basically instantly, and we see every week that unemployment claims are up, and a lot of that is coming from small businesses that are having to lay off workers or are shutting down completely. So that is going to be an ongoing discussion, is how much more money do small businesses need so that many of them hopefully can survive this crisis and be there when their states do begin to open up.
So the AP has been doing quite a bit of polling over the course of the virus, trying to get a sense of where Americans are on various issues. There's been a couple of relatively new ones, one very recent. I wanted to hit on some of those with you. AP NORC Center for Public Affairs Research survey asked Americans about who they're trusting for reliable information on the coronavirus outbreak, who scored high marks there, and who are Americans a little more leery about listening to.
Yeah, I love this survey because I think it's one of those things that, a lot of Americans are just asking right now, which is, who do I trust? There are so many conflicting pieces of information out there right now about, who should you trust? Where do you get your guidance on what to do? And what our survey found is, one, a lot of people are struggling with that. Two, they're more likely to trust the CDC. Obviously, this is the agency in the US that is providing a lot of the pretty straightforward medical guidance and information about how you should handle things, in terms of whether you wear a mask, whether how schools might open up. So interesting to me that people are really gravitating to that kind of information. Similarly, they're also very interested in information from their own doctor or healthcare provider. People who maybe they have a long-term relationship with. And then, as I mentioned, when we were talking about governors, state and local governments get fairly high marks from Americans. It is interesting to me that Americans say they're pretty skeptical about information from two places. One is from the media, and two is from their friends and family. So they're pretty skeptical about things like those Facebook posts or those chain emails that might get sent around. And of course, the other person that they say they don't have much trust in right now is the president. And we saw those numbers really come to the forefront when he was doing those briefings on a daily basis, and in a lot of ways really muddling the message, because you would have him on the one hand talking about restrictions and on the other hand talking about how the economy should be reopening. And I think people were getting confused, and we see that reflected in these poll numbers.
So another poll we did recently, and it sort of ties back to where we started this when we talked about campaign rallies that the president likes to do and is probably looking forward to doing. And quite frankly, even the presumptive nominee on the Democratic side, Joe Biden, he's got to figure out a way to get his message out without being able to appear in front of big crowds. So that talks about elections. And we asked Americans about voting by mail and the idea that the coronavirus outbreak might make it really tough to vote in person in November. What did we find in that survey?
Yeah, so this is going to be a huge debate in the election over the next 6 months, because there is a real question about whether it's going to be safe in places for people to go and vote in person. And interestingly, we find that vote by mail is becoming increasingly popular. It's also becoming popular with parts of Trump's base. Older voters like the idea of voting by mail. They're more nervous to go out maybe and go to a polling place in person, in part because they're at higher risk from the virus. And so this is going to be really fascinating to watch, because Trump and Republicans have been so opposed to vote by mail, as they watch these numbers start to shift, if this trend continues, and if their own supporters say, hey, we want this option, will they have to loosen up their opposition to vote by mail?
Julie Pace is AP's Washington bureau chief. Thanks so much for talking some politics today on a Friday, Julie. Thanks, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thanks, Ralph. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.
At apnews.com, today's One Good Thing feature is a story about a relatively small problem that seems to be nagging everyone during the pandemic lockdowns. What to do about our messy and longer than usual hair. In Bangkok, a hairdresser is stepping up to provide free haircuts to medical workers who are on the front lines in the fight against COVID-19. You can read that story and get all of AP's coronavirus outbreak coverage at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com.
From the Westwood One Podcast Network.